Welcome everyone to today's Bellwether League Foundation Spotlight series. Today we're going to be talking about supplier relationship management and how to mature it. It's going to be part of a two-part series, and this was formerly our Fireside Chat series if you've watched one of those before. My name is Rachel Anderson. I'm a Future Famer 2023 class from the Bellwether League, and I am the Vice President of Supply Chain at DCH Health System in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And with me, I have Tom Lavatsky, who is the former Chief Supply Chain Officer at Allina Health. And he has 44 years of healthcare experience in the industry and is still actively engaged on several projects in the community. And one of the topics that we really felt like our leadership wanted to bring to the table today is supplier relationship management. What does that mean to the organization, and how can we mature it? So that's the topic we're going to talk about today. So Tom, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you being here.
Yeah, great to be here.
One of the first things I think that comes to mind when we talk about supplier relationship management is how that has changed, especially given the COVID-19 pandemic and everything that has transpired since. We've taken things from more of the traditional contract management relationship model, and it's more of a partnership now between those suppliers. And so one of the questions we really wanted to think about and ask you today is, why are these relationships between providers and suppliers so important?
Yeah. So, I would tell you today that we probably under-optimize the value of driving good, sound, mutual relationships between supplier and providers. And I say mutual because there's a lot for them to gain from providers as well as us to gain from them. It's got to be a win-win. But we've just been so stuck in that transactional world. And I think we learned in COVID, at least at Allina, we did, that the suppliers have great depth in terms of capability, expertise, and so forth. And so a quick story, real quick. During that time of COVID, Medtronic at Allina came forward, and it was really one of our senior leaders that approached them about, we've got all this pileup of patients, of course, in the emergency room needing to seek care, and we're concerned around the safety of our employees as well as the safety of our patients and the throughput and so forth. Well, they took that as a challenge, and they brought in their team of engineers and others, and they actually customize the way and the throughput through the emergency room. Now, Medtronic sells, as we all know, technologies and products, and you say, why would they do that? Well, they're in corporate headquarters in Minneapolis, and they felt compelled to say, let's help this community out. We've got some serious issues. That kind of partnership goes way beyond the transaction, right? And so that was such a clear example about working together and designing something that was really needed beyond just what we do on a commonly transactional basis. And so that's what I mean by underestimating or under-optimizing the value around what they bring. By the way, that example, once we did it at Allina with some of our hospitals, that we took it community-wide, the same model, and helped out the other emergency rooms. So it was huge impact. And so nothing more important than, right, the safety of our communities and around their health. And here's a supplier that's just stepped up, right, and worked with us in a totally different capacity. And that's what I mean, is that we've got to mature these relationships and go deeper and develop more of the relationships between executive teams to really foster the value that we can achieve with both of our us at the table. Yeah.
I learned that, I think, firsthand when I started at DCH. About my third day was the IV fluid crisis and the hurricane that had hit.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
in Asheville and around the Asheville area in North Carolina. And so I was jumping on the phone with every person that I could, reach out to within my own network across all of the providers, as well as just different networking that I could do to try to come up with some options for our patients and our community here for DCH, so that we could try to make sure that, we could mitigate those impacts as much as possible and make sure that our community and our patients were still getting care. And the team was fantastic. And we found that we didn't have to cancel a single case. And so that was huge for us. And it was a win with the suppliers with their engagement and willingness to jump in and help. So that was something I learned firsthand too.
Yep. Yeah.
Where do you think that health systems are currently falling behind when they have evaluations for a supplier relationship maturity, and when they look at how they evaluate their suppliers and how they hold them accountable?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, there's different relationship segments around the maturity of managing these relationships with suppliers. So even at the transactional level, right? You want them to be really, really good at their transactional work. And so scorecards, making sure that those are sound, making sure that the communication, the setup around the whole procure to payment is well understood, and that they're working, jointly together very, very nicely. That's all really, really, really important. But where we fall behind is that we don't take the time to plan on what other kinds of events or work we could do together that
Mhm.
are important to the provider organization based on their strategic imperatives and so forth. And what can suppliers do to enhance or achieve and bring more value around the work that we have to get done, right? We don't take the time to really have that kind of conversation. So we fall behind because we don't have that conversation. We seem to kind of just take it all on our own. And our suppliers have great strength. It's small, big, and I mean the small ones too, because they have niche type of services and solutions that really can bring great, great value. So, but it starts with our sourcing leaders and our sourcing teams. And you got to explore, and you got to make sure that you're having this kind of conversation, and there's guidance there needed, right? Around, well, how do you do that conversation? Because immediately you want to get into, well, let me ask you how you're doing on your contract performance, right? And and while that's important, and we have to, as I said earlier, do that really well, planning and really thinking through, well, how can this supplier perhaps help me in a specific spot in my areas of focus are at my healthcare system that could lead to a collaborative project,
Mhm.
that we both agree upon, that will bring value to us and will bring value to them. And then just begin to work on that basis, but explore the opportunities and do the planning is what I'm really saying is so, so important. We just don't do that. We don't, naturally do that. And I'm saying that if we want to take advantage, you can't do this with every supplier, right? But there's
Right.
selected suppliers that you can do this with, and you should be pressing with them and they with us around the areas that they could vector and focus
Mhm.
in on adding some additional value. Yeah.
How do you determine that framework and which suppliers to go partner with? I know,
Yeah.
just an example for myself, coming in as a new leader to a new organization, one of the things that I was trying to do was get my hands around which suppliers I needed to have quarterly business reviews with and identify those opportunities, but then strategically work with administration on what is key initiatives that are key things that we're working on in our communities. So what's kind of the building blocks to getting that started?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first phase of segmentation, figure out, well, where does the supplier best fit with potentially helping us is really centered on our service lines, right? Because not all suppliers impact every service line, and I understand that. I mean, there's obviously those that just But there's always a connection to the delivery of our care, right? So I say that and then I catch myself because I'm going, well, that's not totally true because there's reliance on them in terms of how we provide the care to our patients. I don't care if it's utility company to a food service company to whatever, we rely on them in every day in terms of the provision of our care, and that can't be always disrupted. So categorizing them though on the impact around their service lines and what they bring is one way to start thinking through them, what they can do, the financial value that they could bring, the essential products or services that they bring. Where does that fit? But again, I want to go back to saying segment it based on the imperatives of the organization, of the healthcare system. So, kind of that as a first phase. And then second phase is kind of like the normal performance metrics, right? Well, how are they performing currently on the contracts that we have awarded with them? And so that could be all sorts of things based on what we decide are important in terms of our supplier scorecard, whether it's, price performance to on time and full delivery to other metrics that each of the healthcare system feels that's an imperative. So if you start there, you start kind of dwindling down. Well, where are the opportunities? But it's always goes back to, well, what's the imperative of our organization right now that we need to address? So how can you add value beyond the transactional value that you may help me bring more further impact? And then begin the conversation, right? We have these imperatives. We have this work that needs to be done beyond what we're already contracting with you. What are the things that you see as your company could potentially bring in terms of additional value and impact that would be really imperative that we address? So that would be the path I would choose.
That was one of the things I was excited about in my new role is getting to have a seat at the table and be in those strategic discussions with our senior leaders, with the C-suite, talking about, those things that we can do to advance our initiatives, but also for supply chain to be at the table. So I think we've
Yeah,
seen a great shift in that, especially since the pandemic.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And by the way, those natural urgencies that we have, whether it's IV solutions or whatever, COVID and so forth. Let's not beat up on the suppliers that are saying, well, you're not helping me, because they may have solutions you may not even be thinking about that they can offer that really are a way to get through the disruption, right? And so, I learned a good lesson on that during COVID. Of course, everyone was after masks, right? And so I went to our primary provider, which was 3M and in terms of mask. And lo and behold, we discovered that, based on our current situation, he said, Tom, you probably use more of those elastomeric masks. You don't need all of this. Well, can you come in and assess our labor force and around who would only need that? Well, as you can imagine, here they brought a solution. So they came in, they did the assessment, they partnered with us, and everyone's pointing their finger at saying, what, you're not helping me, because we got this, but they were challenged themselves. But here they came in and offered the solution for us, and that really lowered the demand for the masks that were most critical, right? And so that helped us get through that period of time. So leaning on them, even in the worst of times, is what I'm saying.
Mhm.
Take the time to do that. That's the maturity around how we have to work with each other in terms of getting through that kind of crisis.
That's one of the things we're working on internally with our value analysis program and maturing that is looking at cost, quality, and outcomes. And it's not just the cost of the product, but to your point, utilization around the product. And are we using it appropriately, and engaging the supplier to help us do that?
Yep.
Is very helpful. And we've already seen increased partnerships through some of the initiatives that we're doing right now. We have one in our lab space, and we're looking at butterfly utilization and how we're actually, tracking that. And we're also looking at urine culture contamination and several other initiatives like that. For organizations that maybe don't have a supplier scorecard already developed, I know you mentioned key performance indicators and looking for those things that you're measuring within those contracts. What would you recommend as kind of the first starting point to establish those scorecards?
Well, I think sitting down with the supplier and around really get their perspective around what they feel are what they want to be held accountable for in terms of their performance, right? We kind of rush and saying, well, this is what I think is important. Well, what do you think? And I think starting with that, you learn a lot about the company around, well, what are they focused on? And they may miss a metric. They're saying, well, we're not really prepared to measure that. Well, let's put that on the parking lot, but let's move toward measuring that properly. So it's a two-way discussion. I was at a conference where we shared scorecards, all providers. Of course, there's not one single standard out there around a scorecard, and they all
Right.
varied. And everyone, even the provider organizations, were saying, well, I think this is important, while another one didn't even have that metric on it. So there is no standard scorecard. You can guess what are the common maybe KPIs around price benchmarking and making sure that the delivery of service in terms of disruptions, and measuring that is in play. How well are we working together on procurement and payment, and all of that. But there's there's a lot of difference in terms around how people perceive what the real value is even on a transactional basis around what's good performance. So I think we have a lot to learn among the providers around that and saying, you know, why do you feel that that's important versus another metric and so forth. So there's no standard out there, but I think the conversation really begins with the supplier around, well, what do you think is the most important way that we ought to be measuring your performance, and hear them out, and then get into an agreement around what the standard looks like. Some organizations, and I think we all prefer this, just have a one common scorecard. This is how we gauge you. And yes, there may be material differences around each of those metrics based on the product or the services that you're representing, but this is what we think is most important. So I think that standard is probably helpful. A lot of variation can get very, very unwieldy and difficult to manage.
What matters most in having those conversations with suppliers? What's one important dimension that comes out of those conversations that helps drive future progress?
Yeah. Well, the willingness to engage in a sincere, thoughtful, planning fashion, right? And I mean that. I mean, you can tell which ones are serious that want to engage and ones that just want to keep at the transactional level, which is fine. But if you want to go beyond that, you pretty well get the sense around which ones are really wanting to engage in a different fashion and bring different kinds of services or value back to the healthcare system. So, it's not something that you measure, it's something that you feel, but that engenders trust, and that engenders confidence that we can work with a supplier that's going to be thoughtful and planning what is real focus on the value dimensions that we ought to be bringing forward, and where the areas again of importance that we should be thinking about how can we interact together in a productive way. So I'd say that is really the key dimension. It's just you have a partner who's willing to engage and plan and do the right things. Is really, really important.
What are two or three maybe foundational elements that you think a provider needs to have in place before they attempt to even go start to scale and look at supplier relationship management?
Yeah, you got to have an infrastructure, and we fail at this. You got to have what I call project or program management, Because if you're really going to establish formalized projects with suppliers and so forth, you need a project manager from their side, you need a project manager on the provider side to work together to hold people accountable on the work that's going to get done. Otherwise, this does not get formalized in the way that it should, and it just fizzles, and then everyone's disappointed. So clear dimension is you've got to have some project and program management on both sides to really work together successfully around that. I would say secondly, and this is something on both organizations, supplier and providers, we need to do. You got to make sure that the senior level executives understand, why are you doing this, right? What's the purpose? And the belief that managing our way in this fashion is going to produce better results, higher value for both organizations, and a commitment to doing it in this fashion. Because you're going to run up against, great project, thank you, but did not understand the relevance from the senior level perspective around, why did you choose this, right? So I think having their engagement at the very beginning is really, really important. For the very, very, very mature relationships, and I call those strategic or integrated, then you have formal governance. So you have formal, setup of governance of the seniors level executives with their leaders set up around bodies of work that are going to be done with, obviously, higher accountability around performance and monitoring of the work that's being progressed. But, I would say that's where the program management, project management comes so vital. But that engagement and senior leaders and really is so important to make sure they understand the why and how it connects to the value propositions to both organizations around the body of work. I think that's really, really important. And then I would say lastly is the communication, right? Keeping people informed around the body of work on both sides, but the transparency and the communication around that is really, really, really key.
I 100% agree. And I think during our next session, I'd love to dive more into that and talk a little bit about how do you make that stick? How do you make sure that communication is clear across all parties involved and that you understand the why and the how and vision behind what you're asking. So
Yeah.
thank you so much for giving me a couple of minutes today and starting to have a conversation around supplier relationship management.
Yeah,
Appreciate your
thanks,
time.
Rachel. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to talk that with you.
Thank you so much. We'll talk soon.